All right, welcome back to part two of this series on war and peace in the Quran and the Islamic tradition. This is the bonus section. I promised that we would go back to this 11th century quote by an Islamic jurist who argued, or at least expressed that evolutionary theory of jihad, that jihad went through these four stages. That is pacifism, defensive war, and offensive war within certain strictures, and then unlimited aggression against all unbelievers. So let's look at that first part. That first part is justified by saying that 16:125, that is calling to people with wisdom and goodly exhortation, was only in this pacifistic stage. Well, let's look at the very next sentence. And if you punish, then punish with the like of that which you were afflicted. Again, that's qisas. But if you endure patiently, then that is better for the patient. So you see that qisas is always kind of morally justified in the Quranic discourse, but it's always pushing for a higher ethic, which is to endure patiently. So I think it's very difficult to claim that this passage was abrogated before warfare was accepted, because even the end of this passage is saying to be patient if you can. And I think this shows the atomistic reading of the exegetes. Firestone mentions how Tabari actually argued that 16:126 actually abrogates itself. That is, this first part was soon abrogated by the second part, or the other way around. I might have mixed that up. But the point is that they didn't even understand single verses in a unitary fashion. So I don't think this is a way that we should approach the text if we're trying to understand what the text might have meant to its specific audience. If we want to understand it for its reception history, then this is certainly something that we should do. But we should be aware of the movement that the classical jurists are making. Now, as far as the second stage of war, I got no problem with this section. So I'll move on to the third and fourth. We already talked about, in the case of the third offensive war, we already talked in detail about 9.5. So I'd refer you to the previous lecture on that. And we also dealt with 2.190. But I did want to talk a little bit about 2.190. Again, look to lecture 1 for more detail. But here it's interesting that he says, after this, they were enjoined to fight absolutely and fight for God's cause. Let's look at verse 2.190. Yeah, there is fight in God's cause. But then right after it says, against those who fight you. So this would not be in stage 4 of jihad, according to that schema, but it would be in stage 2. And then you have, but do not aggress, for God does not love aggressors. So really you'd have to argue, and this is why I call it the sub-atomistic reading of the Quran, that the fight in God's cause is abrogating what comes right after it, which doesn't make any sense. And then, I mean, there's so much abrogation going on in between a verse. This is really textual acrobatics to fit the legal theological imperative that the classical exegetes needed. I already talked about this verse in the previous lecture, so I'll skip that one. I did want to come now to, we talked about, we've pretty much come up to the point where the prophets, the Meccan, well, let's talk about the life story real quick, or the events. So we know that the Prophet Muhammad was born in Mecca. He declared his prophethood at age 40. Once he declared his message publicly, the Meccan pagans, the Quraysh, they persecuted him and his followers. They initially fled to Abyssinia, some of them, and then eventually most of them fled to Medina, or Yathrib at that time. At that time, there was a heated war between the two sides. And then eventually a treaty was signed, the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, between the Muslims of Medina and the people of Quraysh, the Meccans. And then we know after a couple of years, after a few years, the Meccans violated that treaty. And so the Quran throws off the treaty, and the Muslims re-engage into warfare with the Meccan pagans, and Mecca is conquered at that time. Well, let's talk about that conquest of Mecca. It's widely reported in the sources that it was a bloodless coup. Only a handful of arch enemies were punished, but other than that, there was a blanket amnesty that was issued. And keep in mind, this was a blanket amnesty for the people who had tormented the Prophet for his entire prophetic mission. They were his arch enemies. All of these verses in the Quran that are used by Islamophobes that show how inimical the Quran is towards these people. Well, it's these same people that the Prophet is now has power over. Let's see what the Quranic discourse is now that the Prophet is in the position of power. So keep in mind that one of the criticisms of Islamophobes is that the Prophet acted in an opportunistic fashion. That is, the Quran advocated peace and reconciliation when Muslims were in a state of weakness, and that once they got more and more power, they became more and more aggressive, until finally when they were in a position that they could do that, they advocated holy war against all infidels. Now, I actually do agree that the medieval interpretation does suffer this flaw. It really portrays the Prophet and the Quran as being very opportunistic in nature. But if we actually look at the Quran, I think this is debunked. Let's look at this passage here, where the Quran says, "It may be that God would forge affection between you and those of them with whom you are in enmity." God does not forbid you from treating kindly and justly those who did not fight you on account of religion and did not drive you out of your homes. Verily, God loves the just. God only forbids you from befriending those who fought you on account of religion and drove you out of your homes and supported your expulsion. Whoever befriends them, that is those specific group of pagans who fight Islam, whoever befriends them, they are the wrongdoers. So again, this ties into that verse of the Quran about not taking the Jews and Christians or the unbelievers as patrons over the Muslims. This is what it is talking about. It is not forbidding kindness between neutral non-Muslims. It's speaking about a very specific group. And the Quran is leaving open the possibility that he will forge affection between you and those of whom you are in enmity. And by the way, this passage is most likely revealed very late in the prophetic career. This is a quote by Shirag Ali, who we mentioned in lecture 1. Basically, he argues, and he points out that after the conquest, the people of Mecca submitted without bloodshed, and hence it is obvious. Okay, so this is actually a really important point that he's making. He's saying that it is obvious that the injunctions contained in the commencement of the 9th chapter of the Quran were never carried out. They remained as a dead letter. Okay, so in lecture 1, we looked at Surah 9, the Declaration of Disassociation, which does use threatening language against the specific group of enemies, idolaters, who violated the treaty. And it did say some threatening things in those. And we know that Islamophobes always quote those parts, of course, with a lot of ellipses, half quotes. But Shirag Ali is making another keen point. He's not only saying that those verses only have to do with a specific group of unbelievers, he's saying that even those verses were never actually carried out. And we know they were not carried out because when the prophets conquered Mecca, he issued a general amnesty. And that's evidence for that in the Quran itself. Before we get into that evidence in the Quran, I also wanted to see what the implication of this view, this point, has with another verse of the Quran, which I think is often quoted. It's verse 533. in which it's very militant language. It says, "Verily, the recompense of those who wage war against God and his messenger and endeavor to work corruption on this earth is that they be killed or crucified or have their hands and feet cut off or they are banished from the land," etc., etc. Of course, now notice there's always the mitigating part of the verse. Save those who repent before you overpower them. I would like to argue that it is a reasonable interpretation to say that this too is a threat that the Quran uses, but it never actually is implemented precisely for the same reason that Shirag Ali mentions, that the Prophet, so this passage is being directed toward the Meccan Quraysh, the pagans, that look, this is what you deserve. You deserve to get all of this. You deserve to be killed. You deserve to be crucified. You deserve to be banished. This is all the things that you deserve. And if you don't straighten up, we might just do these things to you. I think this is a Quranic threat, but I don't think it was implemented. So I think it would fall under the same understanding that Surah 9 does. And I think my interpretation makes more sense than some of the classical interpretations, which seem to say that this has to do with Hiraba, or this verse has to do with kind of highway banditry, meaning nothing to do with war, even though this specifically mentions those who wage war against God and his messenger. I think, again, they are stripping the Quran of its actual context and replacing it with a completely different context. And even though I know that some modern Muslims are using that to justify, rules against terrorism by calling it hiraba, I don't think this is I don't think this passage is talking about highway banditry. So again, the point is that all of this was a dead letter, in my opinion, because of the bloodless conquest of Mecca. So when the Prophet was about to when he did conquer the city, he asked the people, "What do you think of me, and what do you think I will do to you?" Now, of course, this is in the secondary sources. We can take it with a bit of caution, a grain of salt. I'm going to show proof in the Quran itself of something similar, but let's just read on. So the Quraysh replied, "You are a magnanimous cousin of ours. If you forgive, then that is what we expected of you. If you take revenge, then basically we deserve it." The Prophet replied, "I say to you, as Joseph said to his brothers, no censure is upon you today. God forgives you, and he is the most merciful of the merciful." Now again, we have proof from the Quran. Before we get into that, I want to talk about this verse, 5:3. "This day I have perfected your religion for you." This is considered either the last verse of the Quran or one of the last verses of the Quran, precisely because it says, "I have perfected your religion for you," and there's some other reasons why we would think this. Bottom line is, this is the last verse, or one of the last verses. Certainly comes after the verse Surah 9 does, right? The sword verse. It comes after that. We know that for a fact. And we know that for pretty good, basically. Look at the sentence right before. "And let not the hatred for a people who once turned you away from the sacred mosque lead you to aggress. Help one another in righteousness and piety. Do not help one another in sin and aggression." So look, it's talking about the people in the past. They turned you away from the sacred mosque. So now this is after the conquest, right? They have been vanquished. The fitna has ended. Now the Quran is saying, so this is almost talking about, so we talked about jus ad bellum, jus in bello. This is actually, I forget what the Latin term is, but there's a Latin term for, someone needs to remind me, but there's a term for justice after conquest, after the war ends, how to treat your enemy. So I think this verse is actually talking about that. So we see that the Quran is actually saying, be just and merciful towards your vanquished foe. Here's a subsequent verse in the same passage. "O you who believe, be steadfast for God, bearing witnesses to fair dealing, and let not the hatred for a people lead you to be unjust. Be just, that is nearer to piety, and fear God." The point I'm trying to make is that many people including the Islamophobes, argue that the last statement of the Quran, and honestly, many of the medieval exegetes said the same. The last statement of the Quran is on the topic of war is the sword verse, verse 9:5, or they say 9:29. But they say the last thing that the Quran says on it, and therefore the great abrogator, is absolute militancy. Whereas the peace and forgiveness, that all came before that. I'm inverting that entire thing by arguing that no, actually in the Quranic arc, the last thing that comes, because the war is over, the fitna is done, the aggression has been stopped. Now the Quran is calling back once again to that higher ethic, that ethic of peace, reconciliation, and forgiveness. So not only did the Quran leave the door of repentance and forgiveness open, and reconciliation open to the unbelievers at all times. Once the Muslims had power, they could have done anything they wanted. But at that time, the Quran called them to that higher ethic of peace, forgiveness, and reconciliation. So I think that puts a big dent into the claim that the last stage was one of militancy. Now, in this bonus section, I did want to talk about slavery real quick. Slavery is a hot topic in slavery in Islam. There have been some books recently. Some scholars have gone into hot water for the things that they have said. I think the reason is that they haven't appreciated the Quranic discourse on slavery. I'm going to refer now back to the same scholar, Sir Sayyid, who wrote who was the first to postulate the modernist theory, the holistic reading of the Quran. He also penned something in Urdu called The Abolition of Slavery in 1893, Ibtali Ghulami. Now, from a philosophical sense, he argued that God made man such a being that freedom and self-independence are a part of his innate nature, or fitrat. He argued that Islam did not abolish slavery immediately. The great turning point, however, was what he called the verse of release, 47:4. So when you meet the disbelievers in battle, strike them in the neck, and once they are defeated, bind any captives firmly, then free them graciously or hold them for ransom until the war lays down its burden. Since that moment, writes Sir Sayyid, that is after the conquest of Mecca, enslavement was completely forbidden to the Muslims. His disciple, Shirag Ali, points out that Umar ibn al-Khattab abolished slavery for the Arabs. We know this from the historical sources. So the question is, why didn't Muslims take the next step and abolish slavery for non-Arabs as well? If he made that movement, why didn't Muslims make the next step? Shirag Ali also opposed, and so did Sir Sayyid, they opposed concubinage. That is, this is often translated as sex slaves. Technically, that's a correct interpretation. However, concubines were not sex slaves in the sense that they could be passed around and anyone can have sex with them. No, they were actually, and you can look this up in the dictionary, and you can look this up in encyclopedias. Concubines were slave wives. That's what they were. They were not at the full level of a wife, but they were a notch below that. And keep in mind, at that time, even wives were not treated that great. So yes, they were not completely free. And I'm not justifying concubinage. In fact, as you can see, I'm very much opposed to it. And so were Sir Sayyid and Shirag Ali. They argued, how could concubines be taken prisoners? How could concubines be taken if prisoners had to be freed? They argued that the verses on concubines had to do with the woman already under the institution of slavery. And even these, the Quran urged to free and marry. Now, this is a topic for another day, so I'm not going to go into detail. What I will say is this. When I first read this, I kind of dismissed this all as, a mere apologia, quote unquote. But then I looked at the verse, 47:4. It says, when you meet those who disbelieve, strike at their necks. Now, Juan Coley makes a key point here. This sounds really bloody, strike at their necks, but that's because it's a literal translation. This linguistically, semantically, Juan Coley argues, likely just means use lethal force. Just like, break a leg means have good luck. It doesn't mean to actually break your leg. That it's a similar verbiage here. So really, this says when you meet those who disbelieve, you're allowed to use lethal force. Then, when you have overwhelmed them, tighten the bounds. That is, take them prisoner. But then it says, then free them graciously or hold them for ransom until the war lays down its burden. So the Muslims conquer Mecca, the amnesty is granted, the war ends. It seems from this verse that you do need to free the prisoners, either free them graciously, that is, without any compensation, or to ransom them. And this could either mean money, or it could also mean, and this is probably likely, it also encompasses you would ransom our slaves, our prisoners for your prisoners. That is, your slaves for our slaves. That is, free Muslim prisoners with the prisoners of the enemy that you have. Now, again, I thought this was all just possibly modernists trying to justify a modern idea in the Quran. But then I looked at some classical sources, and you know what? There might be some precedent for this. Ibn Rushd, Averroes, wrote in his his classic book of fiqh. This is a very traditional Islamic book. He actually writes in it, quote, "The obvious interpretation of the Quran is at variance with the Prophet's deeds." Now, I would disagree with this part, but I would say that it's at variance with what is narrated in the hadith and the seerah about the Prophet's deeds. Again, we're skeptical about that because we don't think that that's a reliable source, but Ibn Rushd does think it is reliable. So he goes on to say, the obvious interpretation of verse 47:4, when you meet the disbelievers, is that the imam is only entitled to pardon captives or to release them on ransom. That is, you only have those two options. You can either free them graciously or you can accept a ransom from them, but you can't keep them as captives. He goes on to say, the scholars say that the fact that the Prophet used to slay captives, again, according to the secondary sources, extra Quranic sources, the fact that the Prophet used to slay captives adds a, quote, supplementing rule to the verse in question. In other words, it's not in the Quran itself. So I think the supplementing rule was added afterward and then back projected onto the prophets. Shaybani's CR, which is another classic Islamic text, this is the classical Islamic text on quote unquote international law. He has a narration in which some early Muslims, very, very early Muslims, said that about this verse, quote, the prisoner of war should not be killed, but he may be ransomed or set free by grace. These are the only two options. Of course, then Shaybani mentions Abu Yusuf, who was his colleague, who held that this view amounted to nothing. But the point is that this view existed. This reading existed. It existed to the earliest time. I mean, these two Muslims that are quoted, this is the earliest times right after the Prophet's death. So the point is that this view that you had to free prisoners, that you couldn't keep them in prison, in slavery, and you couldn't just kill them. This view goes all the way back to the earliest times. And instead, Shaybani says that he came to this view that really the imam should examine the situation and decide whether he deems it advantageous to the Muslims. Again, a very opportunistic view, but the opportunistic view is not borne out in that verse. It really just says, free them graciously. And again, I don't think the opportunism is born in the Quran at all, because the Quran says once you have power over them, then you should be forgiving and merciful. Here's another source. This is another classical tafsir. So Baghawi said, The scholars differed on the ruling of this verse. A group of them said it is abrogated. Of course, any verse that they didn't fit their legal theological doctrine. Again, their legal doctrine said that, it was an empire. They needed to justify slavery. They needed slaves. So they had to argue that it's abrogated. So they said it is not permissible. They not only look at this commentary. They're not only supplementing the Quran or interpreting it a little bit differently. They're actually nullifying the Quran. They're inverting the entire Quran. So here this tafsir says it is not permissible, according to this group, to free graciously or ransom the disbelievers who are made prisoners. Of course, then the tafsir states that other scholars gave all four options: killing, enslaving, freeing, ransoming. And again, another opportunistic statement here. It's only when well, this might actually this next part. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm misremembering this. So actually, this part of the passage leans towards the view that Shirag Ali and Sir Sayyid are saying, that when Muslims actually became more numerous and their power increased, that's when the options were limited to either grace or ransom. Why? Because earlier Muslims were not powerful. They couldn't just release the prisoners, because then those people would just go back and join the pagan army to fight the Muslims. Al-Mawardi, another classical Muslim scholar, and again, he has written stuff about political theory. He says that part of the verse where it says, until the war lays down its burden, has two interpretations. Again, we see now this is the textual acrobatics that the classical exegetes are using. Even though it's clear that until the war lays down its burden means the burden of arms, that is, the war ends, he's saying there's another interpretation, the sins of disbelief in Islam. Why? Why is he saying that? Again, it's the same reason that according to the medieval exegetes and jurists, God cannot forgive the disbelievers for their unbelief, and so the Muslims cannot either. That doesn't go jive with the Quranic discourse, but that's what these classical scholars, they must stand and die for. And so they will defend it at any cost, even if they need to use these exegetical strategies, eisegesis so-called, to manipulate the Quranic text, piously manipulate, of course. I did briefly want to talk about jizya and dhimmis. This is something that Islamophobes like to bring up a lot. Jizya is the tributary tax that is given to first of all, it should be noted, it's a pre-Islamic institution. Islam did not, just like I argued in lecture 1, that Islam did not originate the idea of holy war. Certainly, Islam did not originate the idea of jizya or tributary tax. This existed in the Near East. It existed in the Byzantine, Sasanian, Arabian environment. So Islam just picked this up, basically. Once a vanquished enemy gave this tributary tax, they would then become dhimmi. Dhimmi actually means a protected person. It did not at that time have a negative connotation. Yes, it developed a pejorative connotation as time went on, because Muslims, were considering themselves superior to non-Muslims. But at that time, it didn't have this pejorative meaning. It was a protected person who Muslim armies had to defend. And as we saw in the Quran even says to defend synagogues and churches and other houses of worship. So this idea, a lot of Islamophobes use the word dhimmi in a negative sense, and they talk about dhimmitude. That is, I think, ahistorical if we're going to read that back into the Quran. There is one verse in the Quran that talks about this. That is Quran 9:29. Your professor actually wanted me to discuss this in lecture 1, but I think we just forgot to do it. But this is also sometimes called this verse of the sword, in addition to verse 9:5. This is kind of, many Islamophobes will argue that this is the Quran's last word on warfare. That's not true at all, because we already looked at those verses in Surah 5 that talked about, reconciling with your enemy and being just with them and forgiving them. So we talked about that. But I also want to put forward another theory. I don't know if this is going to stand the test, but this verse 929 is most often used to refer exclusively to Jews and Christians, that is, people of the book. It's argued that that this is that this is specific to them, and that jizya can only be taken, this protection tax can only be taken from Jews and Christians, and that non-people of the book, basically anybody outside of Judaism and Christianity, and maybe Zoroastrians and some other groups, but basically idolaters, everyone else, they have to be killed. So that's actually super militant if you take that view, that jizya is restricted to Jews and Christians. Yes, jizya is a negative thing. It is an inferior status that you become a dhimmi, but at least you get to live. Everyone else is killed. I question this theory. I read this verse because I'm reading this verse in context of Surah 9. We've already seen Surah 9 before. Now I'm reading this verse, and in its context, the whole that surah together, I'm actually of the view that maybe we need to divide this into 1 and 2, as I did. That is, I think this verse is not only about Jews and Christians. I think infidels, like idolaters, are included in this passage. Because we can say it's two groups. Fight those who, 1, believe not in God and in the last day, and 2, and who do not forbid what God and his messenger have forbidden, and who follow not the religion of truth amongst the people of the book until they pay the tribute. That is, I don't think 1 refers to the Jews and the Christians or the people of the book, because they do believe in God and the last day. The pagans, on the other hand, definitely disbelieved in the last day. The pagans, even if they believed in Allah, they believed in other gods alongside Allah. But this construction, God and in the last day, this actually goes together. And so it's really saying, I think the first part is about pagans, idolaters, and then the second part is about Jews and Christians. And so I think jizya can be taken from both groups. And I think it's only later theology that dictated that, again, a legal theological imperative that idolaters could not be tolerated at all. This is my theory. You can take it or leave it. It's hard to prove it either way, but I just think it's a reasonable reading. The other point to mention is that jizya is not taken from all non-Muslims. It's only taken from vanquished foes. So, for example, it was not taken by the Prophet when he covenanted with the people of Medina. I should also point out that no country on earth today enforces jizya or quote-unquote dhimmitude. Even if, I've taken courses through Al-Azhar University, which is the premier institution of kind of conservative Islamic traditional religion. Even they say that jizya and dhimmi status no longer applies, because every human being is now considered a covenanted person. There's a contractual agreement. So nobody's enforcing this jizya and dhimmis. Now, there were some Islamic extremist groups. Keep in mind that not even the Taliban enforced jizya and dhimmis. I think they once tried to in one section, but I might be wrong about this, but I don't think even they did it. ISIS definitely did it. But the point I'm trying to make is this is not something that the vast majority of modern Muslims want to enforce on people. And yes, it was initially an Islamic modernist view that jizya and dhimmi does not apply. But now it's widely held, just like the holistic reading of jihad is now widely held amongst all segments of Muslims, almost all segments of Muslims. All right. I think we will call it a day and stop there. Um, I do want to talk about the sacred months, but I will do that in part 3.